New York Governor Kathy Hochul has signed legislation that will require gun owners in the state who apply for a concealed carry permit to register their current and former social media accounts from the last 3 years. But it doesn't specify if they will be required to provide access to private accounts as well. The law is expected to begin starting in September.
My colleague at Reason, associate editor of that magazine, Liz Wolfe, is back to discuss this policy. Thanks for joining us, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
And my expectation is that this will horrify you just as it horrifies me. And look, I understand, I understand it. I don't agree with it. There's a lot of, particularly from the New York governor, of complaining and blaming social media in the wake of the Buffalo shooting and et cetera. That's a thing politicians often go to say, oh, well, what can we blame other than just like the shooter, right? Oh, well, maybe it was social media in the same way it was violent video games, and it was comic books, or it was Satanism, or whatever it is. Now it's social media, and fair enough, you often find you can find extremist content on social media, and sometimes you find that there were certain warning signs, but what do you make of a measure to broadly force people to give up some of their privacy and their civil liberties just to exercise their Second Amendment rights?
Well, your Second Amendment rights should not be contingent on how you exercise your First Amendment rights. To me, this is quite obvious. Apparently to Governor Hochul, it's not. I think it's really concerning. What we see in the cases of Buffalo and in the cases of the Highland Park shooting is a failure of red flag laws that are already on the books to actually work as intended. The fact that politicians like Hochul are now in the business of passing a bunch of new laws as opposed to actually examining why the existing laws failed, to me indicates a total unseriousness. It indicates virtue signaling. It indicates that they want to get reelected or want to have future careers in politics, but it does not actually do very much to solve this problem. And I'm frankly worried that this measure doesn't even pass constitutional muster. How would this work? The places where we see these shooters talking about their motives and giving warning signs of their plans, we see them on 4chan, we see them on Reddit. These are anonymous accounts that they would not voluntarily turn over. So I think whoever crafted this proposal has thought about it for about 5 seconds.
Right. Handing over your LinkedIn account is not really going to make much difference, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, all right, so here I realize I'm outnumbered by blonde libertarians, but here's going to be my my sort of counter proposal, or my question, I guess, for you, Liz, and for you, Robbie. With abortion, it's very clear, I think, to most conservatives that the thing that makes abortion different from other constitutional rights is that there's a third party involved, right? There's a baby, a fetus, right? There's a life. Another life there that has to be taken into account. It's not just about the woman. It's not just about the mother. And to me, I don't understand how that can't be applied as well to the Second Amendment to say, look, you have a right to own a gun. But guns can kill people. There is another life potentially involved, and many other lives potentially involved in the case of mass shooters. And we do know that they leave these sort of social media trails. So on the one hand, I do hear the First Amendment argument, but on the other hand, we've understood that with Roe, because there is that tension, there is another life, but there is the woman's right to her bodily autonomy. We've decided that the best way to handle that tension between two competing sets of rights is to give it back to the states. And so to me, I don't understand why we couldn't say the same thing about this. Look, we're giving it back to the states. They should get to make their decisions. And yes, you have a constitutional right to own a firearm, but individual states can say, because there is potentially another life involved, we feel that it is okay to put conditions on that. And one of those conditions should be, we're going to look at this from the point of view of, are there any red flags on your social media?
My thought with that is that we do prosecute things when another life is taken, when another life is involved. And that's sort of the point at which our laws become, enforced here. But in terms of your actual ability to own a gun or to carry it nonviolently without hurting another person, to me, allowing the state to intervene and to step in there is a bridge too far. I understand what you're saying, though, of we legitimately do have a massive gun violence problem in this country. And I think it feels highly disturbing and unsettling that we seem to try to tackle it in all different states. And we want them to work like laboratories of democracy, right? We want different states to experiment with different laws to attempt to solve this really, really severe problem. The thing I keep coming back to is that we have existing laws on the books that we're not actually examining why they don't work. And then we even have situations like the Uvalde shooting, which was absolutely tragic, where that police department did not cover themselves in glory. And what I really want is for them to be held accountable. And I really fear that that's not what's going to happen. So I see there being so many different steps that we could all agree on that we could do first to attempt to crack down on gun violence.
Yeah, that would be my response to your comment and question, Batya. Look, I try to be a reasonable person. If giving over your Facebook or your Twitter or whatever else account it is when you're trying to get a gun, if that turned out to lead to some vast reduction in shootings or in mass shootings, then you know what, I might say, okay, that's a fine compromise, setting aside the potential legal issues, which I think might actually doom it anyway. But if we're just to ignore that, okay. But what I see in so many of these cases is warning signs that were noticed by law enforcement, and then there was just no follow-up whatsoever. So my expectation would just be more of that. I mean, it sickens you to read of all the times that the police were called to the house in the cases of, these various people, Salvador Ramos, the Uvalde shooter, the Parkland shooter, right? He was known to 18 different law enforcement agencies. He'd been reported to the FBI. They said, this guy's a mass shooter in the making. Please do something. No one did. So I would expect more of that. The police don't do. They don't take this stuff seriously enough in the cases where it has turned into mass shootings. And I'm sure they can make arguments like, well, we're swamped, or 99 out of 100 times it turns out to be nothing. So whatever. But it's just like they're already doing that and then just not following up on it is what I would think.
We also see this huge problem, which is where social media is always the scapegoat. And I'm sympathetic, like you, Robbie, I'm sympathetic to if we have really good data that indicates that, okay, maybe certain solutions follow. But YouTube, for example, changed their algorithm back in 2019 and actually cured a lot of the issues with what's termed basically far-right extremist rabbit holes. I did a little bit of reporting on this back 3 months ago, and there's some really interesting new research that has been coming out that basically indicates that it's not just these random unsuspecting people who are being drawn by the algorithm to far-right extremist content on YouTube, but rather that these people are already searching for it in the first place, and then the YouTube algorithm predictably feeds them more of that content. But I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about how these rabbit holes work. And then something I know you focused on a ton, Batya, is there's a media malpractice component to all of this, where we pay a lot of attention to the high-profile shootings in Highland Park, Illinois, a very wealthy suburb. And yet, for some reason, we ignore the fact that 5 people were shot 4th of July weekend on the south side of Chicago. If we actually want to be serious about tackling gun violence in this country, we need to not just pay attention to the really sensationalist, high-profile shootings, or just when rich people are shot. Poor people being shot is also a huge problem. All of these lives have inherent dignity and value, and it's really disturbing to me that a lot of inner-city violence is ignored because we're focusing on these really high-profile mass shootings when we need to be finding solutions to all of this.
No, 100%. It was actually 80 people were shot on the south side and 6 killed. The youngest 8 years old and the oldest 85 years old. And if you try to go into the media and find these people's names, you won't even find their names in the media. So I totally agree with you. We know that 1 in 5 gun violence victims in America are Black boys and men between the ages of 5 and 24. We know that Black people represent 54% of gun violence victims, but they're only 13% of Americans, right? We know who the massive violent crime wave is targeting and who gets ignored by the media in the conversation. I totally agree with you about where the focus is. At the same time, to stop one mass shooter in a school, I love what you both said, that, if there is data out there showing that this could actually impact it, you would both be open to it. Like, that's the right approach to everything, right? So I really appreciate that.
Well, and it's it's horrifying. I mean, nobody wants to watch more of these things happen. I do worry, and maybe Liz, you want to speak to this, the kind of broader philosophical idea that is, that underpins some of this, that, okay, to exercise a right, well, you have to, tell the government more about you and what your views are and what you share online. And how could that be extended to, well, you need to express that before you're going to buy a home or before you're going to vote or before you're in a kind of like social credit sort of way that some of our kind of geopolitical rivals have moved toward. And I think that is rightly distrusted and not desired by a lot of Americans of all political stripes.
Exactly. I mean, this law talks about how once you do turn over your social media accounts, law enforcement officials or bureaucrats will evaluate your character based off of the content of those social media accounts. Okay, I don't really want agents of the state, agents of the government to be determining my character or attempting to evaluate it. And I'm not even sure what criteria they would be using anyways. So I think there's this problem, and we see this with a ton of legislation being written right now. This has been a problem for many, many years, where this is terribly ill-defined. And I, for one, am very worried about the expectation being by the state that in order to exercise some rights, you need to allow certain intrusions and you need to allow them to attempt to evaluate your character or to do deep dives into the way you exercise other rights. That's just not how our constitutional rights work. And I really don't think any of this would pass legal muster. So Hochul's really not really doing herself a service. She's doing herself a disservice by crafting such a clumsy piece of legislation.
Well, Liz, we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in just a minute. Stay tuned.